52 years. That is how long the American dollar has sat at the center of every barrel of oil traded on this planet. And this week, at the world's most critical energy choke point, a country under military attack just proposed to dismantle that arrangement in a single sentence. The question is not whether Iran has the power to do this alone. The question is whether enough of the world is already ready to say yes. And the answer to that question should concern every American far more than any missile launched in the Middle East. For half a century, the financial architecture that underpins the American economy has rested on one foundational agreement. It was not a treaty. It was not ratified by any legislature. It was a quiet arrangement, negotiated in Riyadh in 1974 by U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon under instructions from President Richard Nixon. The deal was straightforward in its design and staggering in its consequences. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, Washington would provide military protection and security guarantees to the kingdom. Saudi petrodollar revenues would then be recycled into U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively financing American debt. The details of this arrangement were so sensitive they remained classified until 2016. But the effects were felt immediately and everywhere. Every nation on earth that needed oil, and by 1975 that meant virtually every nation on earth, now needed U.S. dollars first. Not because they wanted to hold American currency, because they had no choice. You could not buy a barrel of oil from the Persian Gulf without going through the dollar. This created what economists describe as a self-reinforcing loop of extraordinary power. Nations accumulated dollar reserves. Those reserves were deposited in American banks. Those deposits financed American government spending. That spending projected American military power. That military power protected the oil supply, which kept the oil priced in dollars. Round and round it went for more than 50 years, generating what France's finance minister once famously called America's exorbitant privilege. The ability to borrow at artificially low rates, to run persistent trade deficits without consequence, and to fund a military presence across the globe at costs no other nation could sustain. And that system, that 52-year-old architecture of American financial supremacy, is now facing its most direct challenge in the history of its existence. Because on March 14, 2026, a senior Iranian official told CNN something that no financial analyst could dismiss as posturing. Iran, the official said, is considering allowing limited numbers of oil tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz on one condition. Payment must be made in Chinese yuan, not U.S. dollars, yuan. To understand why that single sentence carries the weight it does, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, not as a geographic feature, but as a financial fact. Approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply passes through this narrow waterway every single day. 20%. That means 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed anywhere on the planet, in factories in Germany, in power stations in Japan, in cars across Southeast Asia, passes through a channel barely 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. Since the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran began on February 28th, that channel has been effectively closed. 1,000 oil tankers are currently stranded. Oil prices have surged above $100 a barrel, the highest levels since the COVID-19 pandemic. The International Energy Agency has called this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, and Iran is now offering a way out. But the price of that exit is not measured in military concessions or diplomatic agreements. It is measured in currency. Specifically, in whose currency the world chooses when desperation forces a choice. But before we examine what that choice means for the global financial system, we need to understand how the world arrived at this precise moment, because this did not happen overnight. The erosion of the petrodollar has been a slow and largely underreported process, accelerating with each decision Washington made to weaponize its currency rather than steward it. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from over 70% in the early 2000s to approximately 58% today, according to IMF data. That may not sound dramatic, but in reserve currency terms, a 12 percentage point decline over 2 decades represents a tectonic shift. Central banks worldwide added over 1,000 metric tons of gold to their reserves in 2024, the third consecutive year of massive purchases. Nations do not hoard gold when they trust the financial system. They hoard it when they are building an exit. Russia and China now conduct the overwhelming majority of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, bypassing the dollar entirely. Brazil and China signed a yuan-real trade settlement agreement. India is purchasing Russian oil in rupees. Saudi Arabia, whose 1974 Petrodollar agreement was the original foundation of the entire system, began accepting yuan for oil sales and joined China's M-Bridge digital currency platform for cross-border payments outside the dollar system. The M-Bridge platform had already processed over $55 billion in transactions by November 2025, with the digital yuan accounting for 95% of volume. These are not isolated experiments. They are the construction of parallel plumbing. And what Iran did on March 14th was not propose an alternative. It proposed that the alternative become mandatory, at least for passage through the most important energy corridor on Earth. China already purchases approximately 90% of Iran's exported crude, settling those transactions through China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, which routes payments without ever touching a U.S. correspondent bank. That infrastructure exists. It works. And the nations currently watching 1,000 tankers sit stranded outside the Strait of Hormuz are now doing a very specific calculation. That calculation is not simply about oil. It is about the architecture of coercion itself. And to understand it fully, we have to address the mechanism that makes the dollar system so powerful and so brittle. The reason dollar dominance matters to Washington is not primarily about trade. It is about enforcement. When the U.S. government decides that a nation, a company, or an individual must be economically isolated, it uses the dollar system as the weapon. Because virtually all international financial transactions pass through U.S. correspondent banks, Washington can effectively cut any actor off from the global economy with the stroke of a pen. This is what happened to Iran, to Russia, to Venezuela, to North Korea. The sanction system works because the dollar system is universal. But here is the structural vulnerability that Iran's yuan condition exposes. China's CIPS platform allows transactions to settle between Chinese and Iranian banks, or any two banks in the CIPS network, without the transaction ever touching a U.S. institution. If a Japanese energy company pays for Iranian oil in yuan through CIPS, there is no U.S. bank in that transaction. There is no dollar involved. There is no sanction that can be applied. The mechanism that makes American sanctions work simply does not engage. This is not theoretical. This is the operating reality of the global financial system in March 2026. And the nations watching their tankers sit outside the Strait of Hormuz are energy importers who are not themselves under American sanctions, who have no desire to be, but who are now being asked to choose between economic pain and a payment rail that Washington cannot touch. The arithmetic of energy desperation is working in Iran's favor. Every week, the strait remains closed. The practical appeal of the yuan alternative grows, not because nations want to challenge American power, but because they need their oil. Now let us be precise about what is known, what is not yet confirmed, and what this proposal actually means in practice, because the reporting demands that level of honesty. What is confirmed is this. A senior Iranian official told CNN that Iran is considering allowing limited tanker passage through the Strait of Hormuz on the condition that cargo is traded in Chinese yuan. This was reported by CNN and has since been widely corroborated. What has not been confirmed is Iranian state media formally announcing this as official policy. The Iranian Foreign Ministry has said that many ships can pass if they coordinate with the Iranian Navy, but has not publicly specified yuan as a mandatory condition in formal government statements. What would confirm the policy is a formal declaration by Tehran, or a documented pattern of tankers receiving passage specifically after arranging yuan payment. As of this recording, India negotiated safe passage for 2 LPG tankers directly with Tehran through diplomatic channels, without specifying currency terms publicly. What this tells us, taken together, is that Iran is using the yuan condition as a strategic signal as much as an operational policy. It is a trial balloon. It is a negotiating position. It is also a message to China, to the Gulf states, to Asia, and to any nation currently watching the crisis unfold about what a post-dollar energy settlement architecture could look like. And the message is being heard. Edward Fishman of the Council on Foreign Relations noted that the countries Trump is now demanding help him secure the strait are the very same countries his administration has been hitting with steep tariffs for the past 18 months. They watched America launch a war without consulting them. They are absorbing the energy price shock from that decision. And now they are being asked to send warships to fix it, while simultaneously being told to pay more in tariffs for the privilege of trading with Washington. In that context, Iran's yuan offer is not just a financial proposal. It is a geopolitical door being held open by Beijing. And the question is, how many nations walk through it? But let us now examine the specific economic consequences that are already materializing for the American economy, because this is not a distant theoretical risk. It is happening in real time, in grocery stores, at gas stations, and in the inflation data that will shape the political landscape of 2026. Oil at $105 a barrel does not stay in the energy sector. It spreads through every corner of the economy within weeks. Transportation costs rise because every product that moves by truck or plane or ship moves on fuel. Food prices rise because modern agriculture runs on diesel for machinery and natural gas derivatives for fertilizers. The UN World Food Program has already warned of significant long-term increases in global food prices, directly tied to the Strait of Hormuz disruption. The Fertilizer Institute has noted that approximately 50% of global urea and sulfur exports, essential components of nitrogen fertilizers, transit through the strait. This war, in other words, is not just disrupting oil, it is threatening the global food supply chain. For the United States specifically, the Federal Reserve now faces the painful choice that every central banker dreads. Oil-driven inflation is what economists call a supply shock. It does not respond to interest rate increases the way demand-driven inflation does. Raising rates to combat energy inflation risks slowing the economy and increasing unemployment without necessarily reducing prices at the pump. The U.S. economy grew at 2.2% in 2025 under these conditions. Trump's approval rating on the economy had already fallen to 34% in a Reuters Ipsos poll before the Iran conflict began. The conflict is costing the U.S. Treasury an estimated $900 million a day to maintain its military presence. And no country has yet publicly committed to sending warships to help share that burden. Now let us bring China into this picture explicitly, because China is the silent protagonist of this entire story. China does not fire a single shot in this conflict. China does not issue threats or ultimatums. China simply operates the infrastructure that makes the yuan alternative viable. China's CIPS payment system now links approximately 4,800 banks across 185 countries. China signed a 25-year cooperation agreement with Iran in 2021, valued at $400 billion, covering oil, infrastructure, and technology. Under that agreement, China receives Iranian oil at discounted prices, settled entirely outside the dollar system. China purchases approximately 90% of Iran's exported crude. China built the M-Bridge platform, which processes yuan-denominated cross-border transactions for central banks in Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and the UAE, allowing immediate settlement without touching the American financial system. And when Iran proposes that oil tankers pay in yuan for straight passage, the country with the most operational capacity to facilitate that arrangement, with the payment rails, the banking relationships, and the institutional infrastructure already in place, is China. Beijing does not need to endorse Iran's proposal publicly. It does not need to threaten anyone. It simply needs to remain available, to continue offering an alternative, to allow the yuan infrastructure to do what it was built to do. Every nation currently facing a choice between dollar payments they cannot easily arrange and yuan payments that come with safe passage through the world's most critical energy choke point is, in that moment, being shown which system solves their problem. China built the exit ramp years ago. Iran is pointing to it now. The question that financial analysts and policymakers are grappling with this week is whether Iran's yuan condition represents a genuine inflection point or a temporary crisis measure that will recede once the conflict ends. The honest answer is that it is both, and that the distinction matters less than it might appear. Even if the Strait of Hormuz reopens tomorrow and oil prices fall back below $80, something will have changed. Nations across Asia, the Middle East, and the global South will have experienced in real time the practical demonstration of a yuan-denominated alternative. They will have watched Iran use control of the world's most important energy choke point to propose a direct challenge to the dollar system. They will have seen the United States unable to immediately reopen that choke point, despite possessing the most powerful navy in history. And they will return to their central banks and their finance ministries with a question they did not have before this crisis. Do we need to hold quite so many dollars? Do we need quite so much exposure to a system that can be weaponized against us? The dollar's position as the world's reserve currency is not going to collapse this week or this year. The Atlantic Council, the IMF, and most serious financial analysts agree that the dollar's dominance is structural and deeply embedded in global capital markets, in the depth and liquidity of U.S. Treasury markets, in decades of institutional trust. But the direction of travel matters. And the direction for several years now has been away from exclusive dollar dependence toward a more diversified, multipolar currency landscape. Iran's yuan condition did not create that trend. What it did was give that trend a dramatic, visible, and highly publicized moment that every energy-importing nation on Earth is watching in real time. That is worth noting carefully. As of today, March 16, 2026, the following facts are on the table. Oil is trading above $100 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil supply passes, remains effectively closed. Iran has proposed yuan-denominated payment as a condition for limited passage. No major ally has publicly committed to joining an American naval coalition to reopen the strait. The Enbridge platform, the CIPS system, and the yuan-denominated oil trade infrastructure are operational and proven. The dollar's share of global reserves sits at 58%, its lowest in a generation. And the United States is spending $900 million a day maintaining a military presence in the Gulf, while simultaneously demanding that allies it has been tariffing for 18 months come and help. The speculative question, clearly labeled as such, is this: if even a fraction of the energy importers currently stranded outside the Strait of Hormuz accept yuan-denominated terms to secure passage, and if those transactions run through CIPS without touching the dollar system, and if that process repeats across weeks and months of ongoing conflict, the cumulative effect on global dollar demand could be measurable, not catastrophic in a single moment, but directionally significant in ways that compound over years. What would confirm this trajectory is the emergence of a documented pattern of non-dollar oil settlement at Hormuz, combined with measurable shifts in central bank reserve composition in major Asian economies. Those are observable, trackable metrics, and they are worth watching very closely in the months ahead. What happened at the Strait of Hormuz this week is not simply a story about oil prices or military strategy. It is a story about the hidden architecture of American economic power, and about how a 52-year-old arrangement, built on a quiet deal in Riyadh in 1974, is being tested in ways its architects never anticipated. The petrodollar system was not designed to withstand a scenario in which America's own military actions simultaneously closed the world's most important energy choke point, alienated its closest allies, and handed its primary geopolitical competitor the opportunity to position the Yuan as the currency that gets your tankers through. That is not analysis with a political edge. That is a description of the situation as it stands. The dollar will not collapse this week, but the conditions that have sustained it for 52 years, universal dependence, no viable alternative, allied cooperation, are all under strain simultaneously. And the nations of the world are watching, calculating, and quietly building the infrastructure for a world where their options are not limited to one.